How did the Visigothic Kingdom collapse after one decisive battle? Were the Muslims actually planning to conquer the Iberian Peninsula in 711? What do we truly know about the Muslim conquest, and how has it been interpreted? I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 22 of the chronological series, we will take an in-depth look at how the Arab and Berber conquest of the Iberian Peninsula and Septimania happened. Interpretations of the Muslim conquest. First, I want to discuss the various historical and modern interpretations of the Muslim conquest. If you are only interested in the historical narrative, you can skip this and the next section using the timestamps in the description. That said, one of the most important tasks of historians is to critically analyze sources and debunk myths. And when it comes to the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, they have had plenty of work to do because few moments in Spanish history have been as distorted as the Islamic conquest. Why do some people revive the Reconquista narrative, portraying Muslims as Spain's eternal enemy? Mainly due to xenophobia and fears over immigration, multiculturalism, and the societal changes that a Muslim presence might bring. Others, in contrast, depict al-Andalus as a utopia of harmony and tolerance to counter nationalist narratives and promote a vision of Spain as a diverse and inclusive society. In this show, my goal is to present history as scientifically as possible, avoiding narratives that either vilify or idealize al-Andalus. First, let's address the narrative that denigrates al-Andalus, which remains deeply rooted in the Spanish collective imagination. Language plays a key role here. Calling it a Muslim invasion is ideologically charged, as the term invasion carries a negative connotation. The same people who talk about a Muslim invasion will never use terms like a Spanish invasion of the Americas or Christian invasion of al-Andalus. Even Muslim conquest is not entirely precise. The most accurate term will be Arab and Berber conquest, as Berbers played a very significant role and many had not yet converted to Islam or had done so only superficially. Similarly, the idea of the loss of Hispania or loss of Spain assumes that the Spanish nation already existed in Visigothic times following their conversion to Catholicism. The Kingdom of Asturias and its successors develop a legitimizing narrative based on their opposition to Muslims, portraying the conquest as a catastrophe. These shape a Spanish identity around the defense of Christianity and resistance to Islam, leading to enduring myths about medieval Spanish history. The Reconquista narrative still has adherents in a small segment of academia, such as Serafín Fanjul and Darío Fernández Morera, and enjoys widespread promotion among pseudo-historians and nationalist circles on the right and far right. From this perspective, Islam and al-Andalus represent the antithesis of Spain, an anti-Spain. This national Catholic narrative has been reinforced by the global far-right's post-9/11 discourse, framing Islam as an existential threat to Western civilization. In this view, democracy, freedom, and human rights are contrasted with Islamic intolerance, fanaticism, and terrorism. Spanish nationalism has always struggled to integrate al-Andalus into its historical narrative. Some reject it outright as a foreign occupation, while others try to assimilate it by speaking of Muslim Spain as if a Hispano-Roman essence had persisted despite religious change. Then there are outright denialists, such as the fascist Ignacio Olague or more recently the Andalusian nationalist Emilio González Ferrín, who claim that there was no Muslim conquest at all. Olague's theory, despite being entirely baseless, has gained some followers. He argued that the eternal Spanish nation was so advanced that it developed an Islamic civilization on its own, without Arab or Berber influence. Ironically, Andalusian nationalist leftists have appropriated this idea, portraying Islamization as an spontaneous internal process, as if Andalusians and Andalusis were the same people. These distortions have been debunked by leading scholars like Pierre Guichard, Maribel Fierro, Eduardo Manzano Moreno, and Alejandro García San Juan. The narrative of total devastation and irreconcilable enmity between Muslims and Christians contradicts historical and archaeological evidence. As I will discuss later, the conquest was a military campaign and therefore involved violence, enslavement, and upheaval. This should neither be forgotten nor whitewashed. However, it was not exceptionally brutal compared to other medieval conquests. Over time, the Christian population gradually adopted Arabic language and culture and converted to Islam with relatively little coercion. Archaeological evidence supports this process, such as mixed Christian-Muslim burials from early Muslim rule, including in Pamplona, where Berber Muslims, Basque-Berber mixed individuals, and Vascons who had converted to Islam were buried alongside Christians. This also confirms that Vasconia was under Muslim rule until its Berber elite was expelled before the end of the 8th century. Opposing the right-wing narrative, a left-wing perspective emerged that idealized al-Andalus in an equally flawed way. This view portrays it as a multicultural paradise, emphasizing religious tolerance, coexistence, and intellectual flourishing. However, this romantic and Orientalist perspective requires significant nuance. It is also misleading to treat al-Andalus as a timeless entity, as if conditions for religious minorities remain unchanged over the centuries. The treatment of Christians and Jews in the 9th century was very different from that in the 12th century. Beyond the Western Wall, the Arab and Islamic world has historically portrayed al-Andalus in a triumphalist light. From medieval times to the present, many Arab sources describe the conquest as divinely ordained. The Arabic term Fat al-Andalus, meaning the opening of al-Andalus, implies that the population opened the doors of the country and willingly embraced Islam. However, different terminology is used when referring to non-Muslim conquests, reinforcing the idea that Islamic expansion was uniquely benevolent, to the extent that some Arabic-speaking authors entirely omit the violence involved in the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. This absurd framing will also be dismantled throughout the episode. Sources for studying the Muslim conquest. Studying the Muslim conquest of 711 is difficult due to the scarcity and reliability of sources. Material evidence such as coins, lead seals, and archaeological remains provides the most reliable insights and has significantly advanced historiography. Written sources, whether Latin or Arabic, must be carefully assessed. The earliest accounts are in Latin and generally more credible due to their proximity to the events. A key document is a letter from Duke Odo of Aquitaine to the Pope, confirming the Arab conquest of Spain via Ceuta, the death of the king, and how he halted their advance in Toulouse. This alone disproves those who denied the Islamic conquest. Another crucial source is the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754. By the early 9th century, new Eastern and Andalusi sources appeared, though Al-Andalus lacked a strong historiographical tradition until the Caliphal era in the 10th century. Arab chronicles present major contradictions. Some describe a violent conquest, while others emphasize peaceful capitulations. Historians like Pedro Chalmeta and Eduardo Manzano Moreno argue that capitulations were common, but disagreements occurred under military pressure. The conquest involved looting, enslavement, and destruction, making it misleading to call it peaceful. Additionally, accounts conflict on key details such as who subdued which city. A frequent critique of Arab sources is that they were written much later, but they have two advantages. They largely align with Latin accounts on fundamental points, and they preserve excerpts from now lost earlier texts. However, interpretations of the conquest vary depending on the chronicler's allegiances. The Umayyads and Islamic jurists portray it as a military conquest, justifying the reservation of 1/5 of the lands for the state. Meanwhile, alternative accounts, such as that of Ibn al-Qutiyya in the 10th century, emphasize treaties over warfare and downplaying figures like Julian of Ceuta to challenge the increasing tax pressure and centralization of the Caliphate of Córdoba. While perspectives differ, all sources agree that both force and capitulation played roles in the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Context to the Islamic conquest. What was the situation of the Visigothic Kingdom and the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus before the Islamic conquest of 711? I covered this in detail in the previous two episodes, and now it's time to recap and also examine why the Muslims launched their conquest of Hispania. In episode 20, The Twilight of the Visigoths, I discussed the final years of the Visigothic Kingdom, ending with the internal divisions and the civil war triggered by the succession crisis after the death of Witiza. King Witiza, around 24 or 25 years old, died suddenly, whether by assassination or illness, without appointing a co-ruler, as his most immediate predecessors had done. Roderic, Duke of Baetica, violently seized the Visigothic throne in 710 after Witiza's death, under uncertain circumstances. What is known, however, is that Roderic was widely regarded as a usurper, and the Visigothic Kingdom was already divided and embroiled in civil war before the Muslims arrived. In the eastern provinces of Tarraconensis and Septimania, the local aristocracy, long marginalized in the selection of the monarch in Toledo, proclaimed Ahila II as king. Meanwhile, in Toledo, Witiza's brothers were determined to retain control of the throne and the wealth that came with it. However, they reached some form of agreement with Roderic, avoiding an outright armed conflict between Witiza's faction and Roderic's supporters. Contrary to what historians believed for decades, the Visigothic Kingdom was not a state in decline. A strong testament to this is a fresco in an Umayyad castle in Jordan depicting the Emperor of Constantinople, the Shah of Persia, the King of Ethiopia, the Khan of the Turks, the Emperor of China, and the King of the Visigoths. It is highly significant that the last Visigothic king was portrayed alongside the most powerful rulers of his time, further proof that the Muslims did not see themselves as conquering a weak and decaying kingdom. On the Islamic side, I previously examined the origins of Islam and the Arab military expansion from the Prophet Muhammad to the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates in episode 21, Islam and the Arab conquests explained. One of the fundamental ideas from that episode is that Islam provided the ideological foundation for the Arabs to unite and pursue an imperial project. However, military success and the pursuit of booty and land were the primary driving forces behind the Arab conquests, far more than any notion of a religious crusade against infidels. Islamic and Arab identity were still in the process of formation, and as the Arab Empire expanded eastward and westward, the Arabs themselves became an increasingly small political and military elite. The conquest of Egypt was swift, but the conquest of the Maghreb took decades due to the region's lack of cities, the Berbers' political fragmentation, and periodic interruptions caused by Muslim civil wars. The man who ultimately completed the conquest of North Africa was Musa ibn Nusayr, the son of an Arab man enslaved in southern Iraq who worked for the Rashidun Caliphate. Because Musa's father proved to be a capable public servant, he was manumitted, and his son Musa followed in his footsteps, becoming an influential bureaucrat in Damascus and in the Arab settlements of Basra and Fustat. Musa gained the favor of Caliph Abd al-Malik, who appointed him governor of Ifriqiya, roughly modern-day Tunisia. He did not disappoint, as the conquest of the Maghreb was finally completed under his leadership. He placed the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad in command of Tangier, while he returned to the capital of Ifriqiya, Kairouan. Tariq was Musa's Mawla, meaning he was his client or subordinate, someone in a relationship of dependency. Keep this term in mind as it will come up again in this and future episodes. After the conquest of the Maghreb, why did the Muslims proceed to conquer Hispania? To begin with, as I will explain later, there is not enough evidence to conclude that Tariq's 711 expedition was initially intended to conquer the Iberian Peninsula. However, what all Arab conquests, later joined by the Berbers, had in common was the pursuit of booty and increased tax revenues. A short-term factor was that Caliph al-Walid I reignited Islamic expansion, pushing the Umayyad Caliphate both eastward, as far as present-day Uzbekistan, and westward, completing the conquest of the Maghreb. Another crucial but often overlooked external factor was that the Arabs were only able to impose the rule over the Maghreb after negotiating with the resistant Berbers. There were non-Muslim Berbers among the conquerors, and those who had converted had likely done so superficially, as very few had learned to speak Arabic or become familiar with Islamic theology and law. The Berbers spoke various Berber languages and dialects, as well as African Romance, a Latin-derived language that served as a lingua franca among them and likely facilitated communication between the Berbers and the Hispano-Gothic population. This lack of Arabization and Islamization among the Berbers is crucial to understanding the conquest, as they were the protagonists in its initial phase. In the end, the Arabs could only subdue the Berbers by making them active participants in future conquests to gain wealth. If Islamic expansion came to a halt, the empire would collapse due to internal tensions, something that ultimately happened a few decades later. Count Julian and the surrender of Ceuta. In traditional Spanish historiography, Count Julian has been portrayed as the ultimate traitor or as proof of the disastrous consequences of vengeance. His figure was used to explain internal divisions and the collaboration of some Visigoths with the conquering power. According to legend, Julian's daughter was raped by Roderic, an impossible claim as Julian had already entered Umayyad service during Wititha's reign. This tale of love, honor, and revenge supposedly led Julian to aid the Muslims. His legend first appears in a 9th century Egyptian chronicle, which contains many other myths surrounding the conquest. In Christian sources, Julian's legendary story did not gain popularity until the 11th century, serving as a moralizing tale about the consequences of a king's sins. All sources unanimously agree that the city of Septem, modern-day Ceuta, played a crucial role in the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Ceuta had been a Byzantine military fortress and naval base controlling the Strait of Gibraltar and keeping both the Berbers and, to a lesser extent, the Visigoths in check. We know that in the 680s, Ceuta was still in Byzantine hands, but beyond that, historians debate its fate. As mentioned 2 episodes ago, in the late 7th century, Duke Theodemir had to repel Byzantine troops arriving by sea in the region of Valencia and Murcia. Was this an attack for plunder before abandoning Ceuta and the Balearic Islands for good? Strategically, there was little reason for the Byzantine Empire to maintain troops in such distant outposts after the fall of Byzantine North Africa to the Arabs in 698. Based on this logic, I lean toward the idea that Ceuta and the Balearics were left under the control of local elites. As a side note, during Musa ibn Nusayr's military campaigns, he sent one of his sons to raid Mallorca in 708, securing some early submission agreements, though the Muslim conquest of the Balearic Islands would not occur until the early 10th century. Count Julian's figure has been so distorted that it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. Some claim he was a Visigothic count who controlled both shores of the strait. Others say he was the last Byzantine governor of Ceuta, named Urbanus, not Julian. And some Arab sources even describe Julian as a mere local merchant. Some historians have taken extreme positions, even denying Julian's existence. However, it was not unusual for a conquering people to find local collaborators, whether or not Julian had been a vassal of the Visigothic Kingdom. Thus, Julian of Ceuta has been considered, at different times, a Gothic count, the last Byzantine governor, or a Christian Berber associated with the former Byzantine administration. I find it very hard to believe that he was a Visigoth, as there is no record of the Visigoths conquering this stronghold. Additionally, the idea that Julian controlled both Ceuta and Algeciras appears to be based on a mistake. Enrique González argues, using geographical texts, that the city called Al-Hadra was mistakenly identified as Algeciras, when it was actually the ancient name for Tangier. Thus, Julian did not control both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar. It is plausible that Julian was the last Byzantine governor and, after the fall of Carthage, sought protection from the Visigothic monarchy. It is also reasonable to assume that he was a Christian, Romanized local Berber who had worked for the Byzantines. Whatever his origins, Julian stood no chance against the mighty Arab Empire. Resistance was futile. Therefore, he made the most pragmatic decision for himself and his people by collaborating with the Umayyad Caliphate, surrendering Ceuta in 709. Julian likely signed a treaty obliging him to provide hostages, pay tribute, and offer logistical and military support to the Muslims in case of war, in exchange for maintaining his authority over Ceuta. The Prelude, the Raid of Tarif ibn Malik. Tarif ibn Malik was the first Berber in Umayyad service to enter the Iberian Peninsula, leading what was essentially a reconnaissance mission ordered by Musa ibn Nusayr before launching a larger operation, perhaps aware of the internal strife within the Visigothic Kingdom. In July 710, his 400 soldiers and 100 cavalrymen landed at Tarifa, a city that now bears his name. This was a year before Tariq ibn Ziyad's famous expedition, in which Tarif also participated. The Tarifa landing was made possible thanks to crucial logistical support from Count Julian, as Ceuta was the only major port in the area, while the nearest Umayyad fleet was in Tunisia, more than a week's journey by sea. The goal of Tarif ibn Malik's raid was to gather intelligence and loot over a few days while remaining as undetected as possible. Tarif and his men encountered little resistance, and what seems almost incredible is that the Visigothic fleet did nothing to counter this attack, or the later landings of Tariq ibn Ziyad. As mentioned in episode 19, we do not know whether the Visigoths had a permanent navy or if they assembled one only when they prepared a campaign. If a standing fleet did exist, it may have been stationed in Valencia, and in that case, it may have not intervened because they recognized King Attila II rather than Roderic. Tarif's small force successfully carried out its mission, likely paving the way for Tariq's landing and assessing the defenses and wealth of the Visigothic Kingdom around the Strait of Gibraltar. Looting and possibly settling in the southern Iberian Peninsula seem to be the Muslims' primary objectives, rather than the total conquest of the Visigothic Kingdom. Although the sources are unclear, Tarif ibn Malik appears to have been far more significant in the Muslim conquest of Hispania than commonly assumed. According to Wenceslao Segura and other historians, Tarif was also one of the leaders of the Great Berber Revolt of 739 to 743, and founded the kingdom ruled by his descendants in southwestern Morocco, the Bargawata Confederacy. Roderic and Tariq ibn Ziyad, the Battle of Guadalete. The success of Tarif's expedition gave Musa and the Berbers confidence to launch a larger offensive. It is highly unlikely that Musa ibn Nusayr was unaware of his Mawla Tariq ibn Ziyad's campaign, as some conquest accounts suggest. Even Caliph al-Walid himself was most likely informed. There is also no solid evidence to support the widespread belief that Wititha's faction had requested military aid from Tariq. Otherwise, they would have already confronted Roderic openly with Berber support. However, nothing indicates that the Berbers under Tariq intended to conquer the Visigothic Kingdom and seize Hispania, and several facts confirm this. First, Musa ibn Nusayr's reaction to Tariq's unexpected success and his anger at Tariq for not waiting for him and acting too independently. Second, the possibility that Wititha's supporters abandoned Roderic in battle, perhaps having arranged it with Tariq beforehand. Third, the Akhbar Maimua Chronicle, which states, quote, "These people did not intend to settle in our country, they only sought booty, and once they obtained it, they would leave." End quote. This is a highly credible account given Tarif ibn Malik's raid the previous year. Tariq's attack should be viewed as a larger-scale operation aimed at securing significant plunder in southern Hispania, or possibly even controlling the area around the Strait of Gibraltar, but again without the goal of destroying the Visigothic Kingdom. If full conquest had been the goal, it is puzzling that the army and fleet from Ifriqiya did not participate in the 711 operation from the outset. They were not engaged on any other front, and their presence would have minimized the risk of failure. Similarly, Roderic and the Visigoths, including Wititha's faction, considered the Berber army a limited threat. It was not the first time that North Africans had raided southern Iberia. Furthermore, Roderic was engaged in a campaign against the Vascons before abandoning it and marching south at full speed to confront Tariq. According to Miquel Pozo's hypothesis, Roderic was in Vasconia before one faction of the Vascons supported the other Visigothic claimant to the throne, Attila II. The Visigothic kingdom must have been aware of the rapid Arab conquest of the 7th century, although no contemporary sources tell us how they reacted to this news. However, it is reasonable to assume that they did not consider themselves at risk from the Umayyad Caliphate, or at least did not anticipate a large-scale conquest at that moment. In April 711, the Berber commander Tariq ibn Ziyad landed at Calpe, later named Gibraltar, in his honor. Due to the limited number of ships available, the landing took several days or even weeks to complete. Tarif ibn Malik and his Berber troops formed the vanguard of the 711 landing, securing control of Algeciras Bay and establishing a base for the offensive. To do this, Tariq and Tarif clashed with Gothic forces from Baetica at the ancient Roman city of Carteia. After defeating them and seizing significant plunder, Tariq gained renown, prompting King Roderic to take action with his army. Meanwhile, Tariq's troops remained stationed around Algeciras Bay and Gibraltar, preparing for the arrival of the Visigothic army. The Berber army of Tariq and the Hispano-Gothic army of Roderic clashed between July 19th and 26th, in the battle that will shape the next centuries of Spain's medieval history, the Battle of Guadalete. However, modern scholarship suggests that the battle did not take place at the Guadalete River. There is no consensus on the exact location, with some historians proposing somewhere near Medina Sidonia, while others suggest a site near Jerez and Arcos de la Frontera, close to the now disappeared Lake of La Handa. The Visigothic army was numerically superior and better armed and trained. Estimates range between 12,000 and 25,000 troops, though the higher figure is likely exaggerated. Tariq's army, composed exclusively of Berbers, since it's impossible that Arabs would have served under a Berber commander, numbered between 7,000 and 12,000 men, nearly all infantry. Unlike Roderic troops, Tariq's soldiers were well rested and had studied the terrain carefully, identifying the best locations for battle. Moreover, they were highly motivated by the prospect of plunder. Tariq did not burn the ships as later legends claimed, as Hernán Cortés did in Mexico. But what is true is that there were not enough ships to evacuate everyone in case of disaster, which pushed them to fight with greater determination. For several days, both sides engaged in skirmishes, but Roderic's cautious approach backfired. The morale of the Visigoths declined, and it's possible that Witiza's brothers, Sigbert and Opas, contacted Tariq to arrange their betrayal, hoping to overthrow the usurper and restore their family's hold on the Visigothic throne. They likely assumed that the Berbers would merely plunder the south and then leave, much like the Arabs in North Africa had done before fully conquering it. Whether this arrangement was made before Tariq's landing, during the battle, or afterward, what is certain is that Witiza's family eventually made peace with the Muslims in exchange for being allowed to retain their lands and properties, estimated at around 3,000 estates. To maintain the unity of his army, Roderic decided to force a pitched battle. He divided his forces into 3 columns, positioning himself in the center while Sigbert and Opas commanded the right and left wings. Despite their numerical advantage, the Visigoths could not fully exploit their cavalry due to the terrain. More importantly, political divisions weakened their army. The battle was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides, and at one point it seemed Roderic was on the verge of victory. Until the wings of the Visigothic army deserted at the climax of the Battle of Guadalete. All sources agree that this betrayal was the decisive factor in Roderic's defeat. Chaos spread among the Visigoths, who found themselves trapped with little chance of escape. Tariq seized the opportunity to push both Roderic's and Witiza's supporters toward the marshes and river. Some Arab chronicles state that Roderic was driven into the river and drowned in the ensuing turmoil. The battle had turned into a massacre. The defeat was crushing. Not only had the king perished, but many prominent magnates and their retainers had also fallen. Thousands of possessions from the dead were seized by the Berbers, and thousands of Hispano-Gothic soldiers were taken captive. The value of the spoils captured at Guadalete was so immense that as soon as the news reached the African shore, many men rushed to join Tariq. According to the Algerian chronicler Al-Makari, quote, "The people on the other shore heard of the conquest of al-Andalus at the hands of Tariq. They came to him from all directions and crossed the sea on whatever boats and rafts they could find, reaching Tariq." End quote. As Pedro Chalmeta puts it, a true gold rush was unleashed, except instead of digging for gold, one could get rich through plunder, whether by looting cities, seizing church treasures, or capturing people as hostages for ransom or enslavement. Many still wonder how could a powerful state like the Visigothic Kingdom collapse so suddenly after just one battle. To understand this, one must grasp both warfare and the nature of kingdoms in late antiquity. The Suebi and the Vandal kingdoms also disappeared rapidly after a decisive battle, and numerous examples can be found in earlier and later periods. It is not unusual for a kingdom to fall after a single crucial battle, especially if the king is killed. The situation is reminiscent of the catastrophic Battle of Bouillé in 507, where the Visigoths nearly vanished as a kingdom, surviving only due to Ostrogothic intervention. This time, however, no allies came to their aid. The problem was not just the military defeat, but the aftermath, reassembling the elite, appointing a new king, and coordinating a response. The unexpected outcome of the Battle of Guadalete and the absolute success of Tariq's forces caught everyone by surprise, including Tariq himself, as the original plan was to acquire booty, not conquer the Visigothic kingdom. But circumstances had changed, and like many military campaigns, what was planned had little to do with what actually happened. Thus, the Berbers under Tariq had to seize the opportunity before them and advance toward Toledo without hesitation. Before that, Tariq's forces captured Medina Sidonia and advanced to Écija, where they fought a second battle against the remnants of the Visigothic army and some local levies. The Battle of Écija was fierce, and the attackers encountered a stiff resistance, but they ultimately emerged victorious once more. According to the chronicler al-Razi, after this battle, the Muslims no longer faced significant resistance. Now the path was open in all directions. The fall of Toledo and the collapse of the Visigothic Kingdom. Following the Battle of Écija, it becomes difficult to trace the exact movements of the conquerors. One version of the events claims that Tariq stopped in Córdoba and waited for his superior, Musa ibn Nusayr, to join him in the conquest, but this seems unlikely. The conquerors needed to act swiftly to prevent an organized resistance and the anointing of a new king in Toledo. It is believed that Tariq advanced with the bulk of his army directly to Toledo, while part of his forces secured the rear by heading to Córdoba, the city that had been Roderic's seat as duke and a stronghold of his supporters. Córdoba was captured by one of Tariq's commanders, Mughith al-Rumi. Though within the city, a church served as the fortress for 3 months until the defenders finally surrendered. Because of this surrender, some Arab chronicles describe Córdoba's conquest as both by force and by capitulation. This dual narrative is no coincidence. When Córdoba became the capital of an independent Umayyad state, it mirrored the tradition that the same had happened in Damascus, the capital of the Syrian Umayyads. A recently discovered lead seal, analyzed by Tawfiq Ibrahim, bears the inscription Qasam Qurtuba, meaning division of Córdoba, confirming that it was taken by force rather than capitulation. While Mughith al-Rumi was securing Córdoba, Tariq ibn Ziyad marched toward Toledo without waiting for Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of Ifriqiya. As news of the Guadalete defeat spread, chaos gripped the Visigothic Kingdom. We do not know exactly what transpired in those days of uncertainty in Toledo, but it will not be surprising if the surviving magnates failed to agree on electing a new king or recognizing Ahila II. One crucial event for the future of the Visigothic Kingdom is recorded in the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, which states that the Archbishop of Toledo, Sinderet, quote, out of fear of the Arab invasion, acting not as a shepherd but as a mercenary, abandoned the sheep of Christ against the precepts of the ancestors and fled to Rome. End quote. In general, the reaction of the church's bishops was one of indifference, collaboration, or escape, as in the cases of the archbishops of Toledo and Tarragona. There was no strong clerical opposition, nor was Islam perceived as a fundamentally hostile religion. As I explained in the previous episode, the notion of Islam as the antithesis of Christianity is a later construction. In fact, according to Eduardo Manzano Moreno, most cities with Arab governors were also episcopal seats, suggesting close cooperation between local bishops and Muslim rulers. Only with time did some bishops and clergy lament the long-term consequences of their cooperation, as the Arabization and Islamization of al-Andalus became irreversible. According to the chronicler Ibn Hayyan, Tariq found Toledo deserted by late 711, as most of the population had fled to the mountains or sought refuge in other cities. Both the Mozarabic Chronicle and some Arab sources agree that Witiza's brother, Opas, assisted in Toledo's conquest, and that some elderly aristocrats were executed by the conquerors. Most chronicles suggest that Toledo did not resist. Given the absence of a king, and with the city's highest religious authority having fled, who had the legitimacy to either resist or surrender the city? Regardless, the fall of Toledo was both a psychological and political shock. It was, after all, the kingdom's capital. For the Umayyad troops, it was also an enormous financial gain, as they seized the Visigothic royal treasury, a symbol of Gothic prestige and a crucial resource for paying soldiers and bureaucrats. With no king, no royal treasury, and no Archbishop of Toledo, the Visigothic Kingdom had ceased to exist in practical terms, as historian Javier Arce asserts. The rapid pace of the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula can be explained by the same factors that led to the swift conquest of Byzantine eastern territories and the Sasanian Empire. It is far easier to conquer and tax a state-based, urbanized society than to subdue a decentralized rural population with no centralized power. A handful of great aristocratic families controlled the Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo, while the broader population had little involvement in governance. History demonstrates how centralized states are particularly vulnerable when a crisis strikes at the top. With the ruling elite divided and then paralyzed after Roderic's death and the fall of Toledo, Without the three pillars of the kingdom, the monarchy, the church, and the royal treasury, coordinating a resistance effort became impossible, and the Visigothic Kingdom ceased to exist. The years following the Battle of Guadalete and the fall of Toledo tell the story of how regional elites responded in different ways to the new political reality. The arrival of the Arabs under Musa ibn Nusayr. Upon hearing of his Berber subordinate's success, Musa ibn Nusayr hastily assembled an army of 10,000 to 18,000 men, composed mostly of Arabs, but also including Berbers. Musa then set out for the Iberian Peninsula, determined to claim the glory of the conquest for himself and remind Tariq who was truly in charge. He also brought a significant portion of the Ifriqian fleet to provide naval support for the campaign. This fleet will not return to North Africa until 718, by which time Spania, now known as al-Andalus, was considered pacified. The Conquerors displayed significant military strength, allowing them to conduct sieges and establish garrisons across the territories they occupied. This was possible because they had the full backing of the vast Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus, resources that later independent emirs and caliphs of al-Andalus would not have. Thus, Musa landed with his large army in Algeciras in the spring or June of 712. According to Christian chronicles, a Gothic officer promised to guide him along a different route than Tariq's, one offering greater opportunities for plunder. Earlier, when discussing the sources for studying the conquest, I mentioned lead seals. Now their significance becomes clear. The seals analyzed by Philippe Senac and Tawfiq Ibrahim have significantly expanded our understanding of the conquest. These seals, used to secure sacks of loot and regulate its distribution, provide insights into which cities fell by force and which surrendered through negotiation. The lead seals reveal that Medina Sidonia capitulated by a treaty, likely to Tariq. Musa's Arab and Berber army, however, took Carmona by force, massacring its defenders. After brief resistance, Seville surrendered with the mediation of Bishop Opas, Witiza's brother. The late seals, referencing a treaty in Seville, confirmed that the city's fall was negotiated. Whether a city was taken by force or treaty was legally significant. Cities that surrendered were required to pay annual tribute, but their inhabitants were granted dhimmi status, protecting their lives, property, and religion. In contrast, cities taken by force became open to unrestricted looting and Muslim settlement. Musa delegated the conquest of Niebla, Beja, and Faro to his son, al-Aziz, and lead seals confirmed that these cities also surrendered rather than being taken by force. The bulk of Musa's army advanced toward the wealthy capital of Lusitania, Merida. Merida withstood the Muslim siege for months, making it one of the few examples of significant resistance during the conquest. However, realizing further resistance was futile, the city eventually surrendered. Its leaders secured the end of hostilities by handing over the properties of fallen soldiers and those who had fled north, as well as valuable church treasures. Archaeological evidence confirms the looting of religious valuables in Merida's Santa Eulalia Basilica, where graves were found desecrated. After the grueling siege of Merida, Musa marched his army toward Toledo to reunite with his Berber Mawla, Tariq. Tariq met with him at Talavera, where Musa reportedly chastised him for his disobedience and excessive independence. Some chronicles even claim that Musa physically struck him. Musa's primary concern was obtaining the Visigothic royal treasury, and Tariq did not resist handing it over to his lord. With this, they reconciled, and Musa and Tariq spent the winter of 713 in Toledo before launching new campaigns. If Tariq had been the vanguard and conqueror, Musa was the consolidator, the one who laid the foundations of the governorate of al-Andalus, establishing it as a province of the vast Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus. As soon as he arrived, Musa began minting gold dinars, equivalent to Byzantine solidi, which were worth 3 times more than the tremesis coins minted by the Visigoths. These coins, produced largely by melting down Visigothic gold from looted jewelry and currency, announced the new political order in Hispania and provided payments for the troops, enabling them to trade with the local population. However, for daily transactions, most people still relied on copper coins. The Muslims swiftly took control of administrative and strategic centers, namely the cities of Hispania, but imposing effective Umayyad authority in rural areas proved far more difficult. Both Latin and Arab chronicles mention that city dwellers fled to the mountains to escape death or enslavement, or to resist Muslim rule. However, these sources also report that many of these refugees perished due to hunger or disease. It is plausible that some fortified and remote settlements serve as refuges and remain beyond the political and fiscal control of the governorate of al-Andalus for years. However, such resistance would have been highly localized and disorganized. Ultimately, many rural communities reached agreements with the Muslims, preserving their lands in exchange for paying tribute, faced with the alternative of military threats from Arab and Berber forces. The Pact of Tudmir. While Musa ibn Nusayr was occupied besieging Merida, his son al-Aziz continued his conquests in the south and southeast. Al-Aziz captured Malaga and Elvira, a regional capital, before being replaced by Granada in the 11th century, before advancing into the regions of Murcia and Alicante. There, in 713, the governor's son signed a treaty of submission with Duke Theodemir, the same leader who had repelled a Byzantine attack during the reign of Egica. Theodemir had fought against the Muslims, was defeated, and took refuge within the walls of Orihuela, Murcia. According to legend, due to a shortage of men, Theodemir disguised women as soldiers to make the Arabs believe that he had more troops than he actually did. The ruse supposedly worked, allowing him to negotiate a treaty on favorable terms instead of risking another battle. The Pact of Theodemir, or Pact of Tudmir, is famous for being the only surviving detailed treaty of submission from Hispania, though different versions contain slight variations. The pact covered 7 settlements and their surrounding rural areas under Theodemir's rule. 4 of these were Orihuela, Mula, Lorca, and Alicante, while the remaining 3 included a Visigothic episcopal seat and 2 settlements that were abandoned within a few decades. The treaty recognized Theodemir's authority and guaranteed the protection of his subjects' lives, property, and religious practices. In return, Theodemir pledged loyalty to the Umayyads, agreed not to aid their enemies, and was required to inform them of any significant intelligence. His people also had to pay taxes in both coin and goods, with the amount varying based on whether they were free men or serfs. Some historians have described Theodemir's domain as a semi-independent lordship or even an almost independent kingdom, but this is far from reality. While negotiating a treaty granted him more autonomy than those regions taken by force, the Muslims still stationed a garrison in Orihuela. Theodemir had to acknowledge Umayyad authority and pay tribute, or face the consequences of rebellion. Over time, Theodemir's name evolved into the Arabic Tudmir, which became the name of a cura or province of al-Andalus, encompassing Murcia, southern Alicante, southeastern Albacete, and northern Almería. As Alejandro García San Juan notes, special attention should be given to the respect shown for the Christian faith to those who submitted. Contrary to the widespread belief that Muslims frequently demolished churches to build mosques, research on the earliest mosques in both the East and the Iberian Peninsula suggests that Muslims built their places of worship in new locations rather than repurposing existing churches. Another Hispano-Goth who submitted was Count Cassius, from the Middle Ebro Valley, later the founder of the famous Banu Qasi clan. However, Cassius only appears in later sources, raising doubts about whether he was truly an important figure who traveled to Syria to convert to Islam and become a Mawla or client of the Caliph, as those later chronicles claim. His holdings were not extensive, otherwise they would have been contested by the Arabs, as happened a few decades later with the lands of Wititha's family and Theodemir. The significance of Cassius was likely exaggerated due to the prominence of the Banu Qasi in the 9th century. The Muslim conquest of the north. It is possible that while awaiting Musa's arrival, Tariq launched campaigns in Guadalajara and captured Amaya, the capital of the Visigothic frontier province of Cantabria, located in what is now the province of Burgos. According to Ahmad al-Razi, quote, "They seized many thousands of captives in Amaya, along with the treasures and wealth of the nobles." End quote. This suggests that many Visigothic aristocrats from Toledo had fled to Amaya, bringing whatever riches they could carry, including portions of the royal treasury. With the influx of commoner refugees, Amaya likely became overcrowded, making prolonged resistance impossible. After reuniting and spending the winter in Toledo, Musa and Tariq resumed their conquests. Musa ibn Nusayr captured Zaragoza in Aragon in 714 and sent Tariq to take Lleida and Tarragona. At the Albobalà site, near Lleida, archaeologists have found coins from the reigns of Égica, Witiza, and Àguila II. The site is particularly noteworthy because it was completely destroyed by fire, almost certainly by the Muslims. Meanwhile, the Visigothic king of Tarraconensis and Narbonensis, Àguila II, died in 713 or 714, possibly in battle against Musa and Tariq. He was succeeded by another Visigothic ruler named Ardo. It was after the conquest of Zaragoza that the governor of Ifriqiya received an envoy from the caliph, summoning him to Damascus. However, Musa persuaded the messenger to accompany him on further campaigns in the Iberian north. In this joint operation, led by Musa and Tariq, Arab and Berber forces advanced through Amaya and captured Astorga, the capital of the frontier province of Asturias, actually in the modern province of León. They then pushed into the province of Galicia, taking Viseu, Braga, and Lugo. This meant that Musa had achieved his goal of conquering all the provincial capitals of Visigothic Hispania. Smaller contingents also subdued modern Asturias, mostly through treaties. In general, Arab sources indicate that the northwestern quadrant of the peninsula, which they called Gilikia, submitted through agreements with the local elites. This might explain why Muslim rule in the north was short-lived, and why Umayyad power never fully consolidated in the region. Both Christian and Muslim sources agree that there was no organized Asturian resistance in the early years. However, the situation in present-day Cantabria is less clear. It is uncertain whether Duke Peter of Cantabria, mentioned in Asturian chronicles, died during the siege and conquest of Amaya, initially submitted and later rebelled like Pelagius, or fled into the Cantabrian mountains with a band of loyalists, resisting Muslim rule until he learned of Pelagius' success in Asturias and allied him to form a unified front of resistance. Regardless, Berber presence in the Cantabrian mountains was minimal. The Muslims encountered the same challenges that the Visigoths had faced in Asturias and Cantabria. The region lacked cities, making administration difficult, and controlling it was not economically worthwhile. The Visigoths had never integrated the northern Cantabrian range into their kingdom or established permanent garrisons there. However, the region remained under Visigothic influence, with local elites periodically paying tribute or at times resisting through armed conflict. The Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus was able to conquer Asturias and possibly Cantabria, establishing small Berber garrisons in the north, such as in Gijón. However, following the same pattern as under the Visigoths, local elites led by Pelagius emerged and rebelled, ceasing to recognize Umayyad authority as political and military pressure increased, along with heavier taxation. Eventually, they expelled the Berber governor of Gijón. Berbers had a much stronger and longer-lasting presence in Galicia and the Duero Valley. Even after the Great Berber Revolt, they remained part of the local elite. However, that is a topic for another episode. The conquerors are held accountable. After these expeditions in the Iberian north, a second envoy from Caliph al-Walid arrived, reprimanding Musa ibn Nusayr for his delay and ordering him to travel to Damascus to account for his actions. Musa obeyed, leaving his son al-Aziz in charge of al-Andalus and the troops stationed there. By this point, only the easternmost parts of Tarraconensis and Narbonensis remained outside Muslim control. The conquerors of Hispania embarked from Algeciras, first sailing to Kairouan, before traveling to Damascus by land. However, rather than traveling alone, Musa sought to impress the Caliph and the Syrian elite with a grand triumphal procession, bringing a significant portion of his army along with a massive number of slaves and treasures from Hispania. This extravagant display may have only deepened the Caliph's suspicions regarding Musa's ambitions. Both Caliph al-Walid and his successor Sulaiman feared, justifiably, that Musa ibn Nusayr might rebel and establish independent rule over the Maghreb and al-Andalus, given his immense popularity and the wealth he had amassed through conquest. Musa was accused of embezzling the state's mandatory 1/5 share of the war spoils, and the fact that he had left his sons in control of North Africa, along with al-Aziz's marriage to Roderic's widow, suggests he may have considered founding his own dynasty, whether within the Umayyad state or outside it. A key detail is that Musa had already been accused of corruption in the Iraqi city of Basra, where he had allegedly withheld tax revenues. So this was not the first time he had faced such charges. Arab sources are nearly unanimous in stating that in the conquest of al-Andalus, the required 1/5 share of war spoils owed to the Umayyad Caliphate, which represented the entire Muslim community, was not properly allocated. Many looted goods were not declared in order to evade taxation. While some accounts claim that land was simply seized at will, a more credible version suggests that Musa personally oversaw its distribution. This misconduct earned Musa a harsh reprimand from the Caliph and a death sentence, later commuted by a hefty fine. The once glorious war hero fell into disgrace and spent his final years in obscurity, dying in Syria 1 or 2 years later, either murdered, according to some sources, or in financial ruin, according to others. What became of Tariq ibn Ziyad remains unknown, but neither Musa nor Tariq ever set foot in al-Andalus again. al-Aziz and the challenges of rule. Meanwhile, in al-Andalus, the new governor, al-Aziz, was tasked with consolidating Arab rule over the newly conquered territories. He launched new military campaigns in Portugal, capturing Évora, Santarém, Coimbra, and Lisbon. al-Aziz also conducted the first census of the Hispano-Gothic population to establish a taxation system and chose Seville as his administrative capital. As previously mentioned, al-Aziz married Roderic's widow. Interfaith marriages between Muslim men and Christian women, as well as the taking of Christian slave concubines, occurred from the very moment of the conquest, just as has happened between conquerors and the conquered throughout history. These marriages between the new ruling elite and local nobility helped legitimize the new regime and provided Muslims with legitimate claims to land ownership in Hispania. However, tensions arose following the arrival of new Berber reinforcements, meant to replace Musa's departing troops. The Arab minority feared losing its dominant social position to the growing Berber presence. This led to a conspiracy against al-Aziz, orchestrated by none other than his own advisor. The motivations behind the plot vary. Some claim it was due to his excessive alignment with the Gothic aristocracy, while others believe that certain Arab factions saw him as too favorable toward the Berbers. The chronicler al-Razi considered Musa's son to have been a good governor, but claimed that under his Gothic wife's influence, he began to entertain ambitions of kingship. Some even accused him of converting to Christianity, though this was very likely a fabricated critique meant to highlight the dangers of mixed marriages. Later Arab chronicles and the nearly contemporary Mozarabic chronicle agree that al-Aziz appeared to be distancing himself from Umayyad rule and may have sought to establish an independent kingdom in al-Andalus. This led to his assassination by Arab conspirators, perhaps even at the instigation of Caliph Suleiman. One Arab account states that Suleiman received al-Aziz's severe head in Damascus and cruelly displayed it to Musa, who cursed the assassins, wishing them the same fate. In al-Andalus, the conspirators formed an interim government, which ruled until a new governor was appointed. The governor al-Hurr and the establishment of Córdoba as the capital. Following the assassination of al-Aziz, the Caliph of Damascus appointed a new governor, al-Hurr, who replaced the interim government and reasserted Umayyad authority in al-Andalus with the 7,000 soldiers that accompanied him. Al-Hurr cracked down on Berber conquerors who had evaded paying the mandatory 1/5 share of the war spoils to the state, imposing prison sentences as punishment. He also rigorously collected taxes among the Christian population. Between 716 and 718, Governor al-Hurr completed the conquest of Hispania by eliminating the last resistance in eastern Tarraconensis, in what is now Catalonia. Only the province of Narbonensis remained as a Visigothic stronghold. Archaeological evidence shows that the Arabs and Berbers forced the abandonment of several Visigothic fortifications, such as those at Puigrom and Sant Julià de Ramis, Girona, constructed their own military encampments, and established an extensive network of watchtowers to monitor the territory and facilitate long-distance visual communication. This demonstrates the military strength of the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus. Al-Hurr's conquest didn't end there. He secured the capitulation of Pamplona through a treaty before 718 and subjugated the Vascons, whom Arab sources describe as an uncivilized people with an unintelligible language. According to chroniclers, the Aragonese city of Huesca endured a prolonged siege of 7 years between 713 and 719, until its inhabitants finally sued for peace and protection of their lives and property. However, such a long siege seems unlikely. People in the most remote mountain valleys of the Pyrenees also submitted to the conquerors and agreed to pay tribute, while the Muslims built fortresses to control strategic passes. All of this suggests that in the northernmost territories, treaties were more common than in the south. By the way, I want to mention that the supposed assistance of local Jews in aiding the Muslim conquerors is a claim that only appears much later, in both Arab and Latin sources, during a period of a strong anti-Judaism. Ahmad al-Razi's chronicle merely states that the conquerors allowed Jewish settlements in Toledo. It was only centuries after the conquest that Andalusi and Christian sources claimed that Jews had betrayed the Visigoths and that the Arabs and Berbers had put Jews in charge of city garrisons. Perhaps the most consequential decision of al-Hurr's tenure was relocating the capital of al-Andalus from Seville to Córdoba, a status the city would retain until the fall of the Umayyad dynasty of Córdoba. Historians suggest several reasons for this move. Seville was too distant from the rest of al-Andalus at a time when Muslim conquests had expanded significantly across the peninsula. Córdoba also had a monumental bridge over the Guadalquivir and fortified walls. Unlike Seville, which had surrendered through a treaty, Córdoba had been taken by force, meaning the Muslims could freely seize land there. However, the most important reason for the capital's relocation was that al-Hurr wanted to distance himself from Musa's supporters. In contrast, al-Hurr's followers were loyal to the Umayyads, so moving the capital ensured stronger control from Damascus and Kairouan. Septimania, the last Visigothic stronghold. With the death of Caliph Suleiman in 717 and the catastrophic Muslim defeat before the walls of Constantinople in 718, Umayyad foreign policy took a dramatic turn. Caliph Umar II ordered an end to expansionist campaigns, limiting military operations to raids for plunder. Umar II even seriously considered withdrawing Muslims from al-Andalus, given the difficulty of defending the territory across the sea, perhaps also fearing its potential independence. While this may seem like a radical idea, it was consistent with Umar's other policies, such as withdrawing Arab forces from the Central Asian region of Transoxiana and abandoning certain occupied fortresses in the Byzantine Empire. In 719, the Caliph replaced al-Hurr with al-Sam to restructure taxation and extract more revenue from al-Andalus, as al-Sam had built a reputation in Ifriqiya for his ruthless approach to tax collection. Al-Sam immediately set to work conducting a new population census to improve the state's fiscal capacity and ensure the proper collection of 1/5 of the booty. He also investigated the property rights of Arab and Berber conquerors. Fearful that the lands they had seized through conquest would be taken away, the conquerors sent delegates to the Caliph to present their grievances, and they succeeded in securing recognition of their property rights. Despite the Caliph's reluctance to continue Islamic expansion, al-Sam captured Narbonne by force. Lead seals found at the Rusino site, near modern Perpignan, confirmed this conquest. It is also possible that in the same battle, the last Visigothic king, Ardo, perished around the year 720. Al-Sam then attempted an incursion into the Frankish duchy of Aquitaine, but it ended in disaster. He was killed in battle against Duke Odo at the Battle of Toulouse in 721. This marked the first major Muslim defeat in Western Europe. After al-Sam's death, his soldiers proclaimed Abd-al-Rahman ibn Abdallah al-Ghafiqi as interim governor. Years later, he will be chosen again as governor and will perish in the famous Battle of Poitiers. The seventh governor of al-Andalus, Ambassa, later eliminated the last remnants of local Visigothic resistance in Narbonensis, capturing Nîmes, Autun, and Carcassonne. The latter surrendered after a siege in 725 and negotiated terms, agreeing to release Muslim prisoners, pay tribute, cede half of Carcassonne's lands to the Muslims, and provide military support if they went to war. With the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, some Hispano-Goths emigrated and settled in the Frankish kingdom. When the Carolingian Empire emerged, these refugees, known as Hispani, played a role in establishing Carolingian rule in Septimania and beyond. Several Arab chronicles explain the halt of Islamic expansion in the west through a legend. According to the tale, Musa himself ventured into Frankish lands until he encountered a statue with an Arabic inscription that read, "Sons of Ishmael, if you have reached this place, turn back." Disobeying this warning, the legend claimed, would trigger a civil war in al-Andalus, so Musa, frightened, returned south. Of course, this story is pure fantasy. In reality, after the conquest of the Visigothic Kingdom, the Umayyad Caliphate was so overstretched that further conquests became increasingly difficult. With this, the narrative of the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula comes to an end, ushering in a new chapter in the history of Spain, the formation of al-Andalus, and the emergence of the small kingdom of Asturias. The verdict. In today's verdict, I want to discuss the accusation of treason that looms over some of the Visigothic aristocracy. This idea is so widespread that I even get comments using the name of Witiza and Julian of Ceuta pejoratively as examples of traitors. First of all, Witiza died before any contact with the Muslims took place, so he's not responsible for anything. As for his brothers and his faction, it's worth emphasizing what I have mentioned before. We don't know exactly when they made their agreement with the Muslims, whether before, during, or after the Battle of Guadalete. And regarding the famous Julian of Ceuta, we don't even know for sure whether he ever served the Visigoths. I will say probably not. What is clear is that no one came to his aid to help him resist the massive Arab and Berber army. So why should he have fought and accepted certain death? Sometimes I come across comments labeling as traitors all those who surrender through treaties. And honestly, I would love to see how some of you will act in a war. You who so comfortably comment from the sofa in your living room. What do you think? That they were supposed to sacrifice their lives just so you could romanticize their heroic but ultimately pointless resistance? The kingdom had ceased to exist after the battles of Guadalete and Écija and the fall of Toledo. With no hope of someone stepping up to organize a coordinated resistance, why should they fight? Especially considering that resisting and losing meant that the Muslims could execute them, enslave them, and seize all their property. And that applied to both the aristocracy and the poor peasants, for whom these changes in ruling elites made little difference. What loyalty did they owe to a kingdom that was already dead? Think carefully about the circumstances in which these people had to decide whether to resist or submit. Put yourself in their shoes and try to be more empathetic. And with that, the verdict ends. With that reflection, I want to remind you that you can join my Patreon community at patreon.com/newhistoryspain to get perks like early access to all my content or having your name appear in the credits. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube, where you will find more content besides this chronological series. In the next episode, I will cover the political history of the governorate of al-Andalus from the 720s to 742, including the Great Berber Revolt. I will also discuss estimates of how many Berbers and Arabs settled in the Iberian Peninsula. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and see you next time!